So Sonic Frontiers was quite a special game when it released last year. Despite its janky gameplay and unpolished bits here and there was a lot of fun with what the game had to offer. Exploring the islands for collectibles and going through the flashy boss fights were mostly enjoyable. The game had some positive reviews behind it and sold pretty well too, but it had its fair share of issues. Cyberspace was really held back with its unoriginality, and the story, although full of neat references and fine characterization, was far from perfect in execution. The game overall is a good formula for future games to follow, but I thought the game itself wasn't exactly worth its full price. After the game's release though, there was an announcement for 3 major DLC packs for the game, and about 10 months later, they're all out for everyone to play for free. So I've gone ahead and played through the game once more on PC, and here's what I thought of it. Let's start off with the main game and its best additions. You can now disable jump deceleration and maintain your boost when jumping, so boosting into a jump no longer kills your speed. Sounds like a minor change, but this makes the game control much better than it did before, allowing for more freedom when it comes to movement. It applies to cyberspace too, so it makes those less of a slog to play again. The power boost cutscene can now be disabled when you achieve max rings. It speaks for itself really, saves time and keeps things moving with no interruptions. The jukebox allows you to collect music notes around the islands and listen to music tracks from different Sonic games. This basically fixes the issues of the default ambient island tracks, so if you want to listen to something more memorable or energetic, there's a bunch of options to choose from. And possibly the best addition to the game by far is the return of the spin dash, but with one major stipulation. It has to be unlocked, and assuming you're playing the game for the first time, the earliest it can be unlocked is on the last island, either by doing all the action chain challenges or by doing the New Horizons story. And when you think of the spin dash, you probably think of the classic spin dash that gains speed from slopes, or maybe the adventure spin dash. But this isn't it. It's basically a boost 2.0 which can hurt enemies and easily launch into the air with a slope. And although you don't get much playtime with it, the spin dash is very broken if used properly. It's basically a move that takes advantage of the game's weird physics, but that's what makes it so great, and I'm really hoping this makes it into the next game. And aside from the New Horizons DLC, I either didn't mess with the other DLC additions, or I thought they were just okay. Photo mode's fine enough, but if I didn't need it for a thumbnail, I probably wouldn't have used it at all. Same goes for the birthday outfits. The cosmetics look nice, but I only used it to get footage, and that's about it. I played through the cyberspace challenge, which was okay, but I'm not a fan of how you have to play all the stages twice over to unlock the power boost. The levels are easy enough to S rank, and if I've done them all before, I don't think a full marathon is necessary other than just padding. Although, using the homing dash exploit made these a bit more fun to go through. For the action chain challenges, I did play through most of them so I could unlock the spin dash as soon as possible, but turns out, the New Horizons DLC already gives you the spin dash by default. The action chain challenges are decently fun though. You just get a bunch of points by doing any action as much as possible, while collecting these orbs to increase your score multiplier. It's simple enough, and going from one course to another is pretty satisfying, but it can be a bit repetitive after a while. It's a decent distraction, but if these didn't unlock the spin dash as a reward, I probably wouldn't play them as much. There's also new Koco obstacle courses, where completing a more challenging course gives you a single big Koco, extending your boost meter as a reward. These challenges are definitely a step up in difficulty, but still nothing to write home about. I'm glad they at least get more use with the climbing mechanics, but that's all I can really say. Some of these courses also expect you to sidestep, but there's like a half-second delay to the move, so it doesn't work very well. Besides, extending the boost meter is a very superfluous reward when infinite boost exists. It's only there for convenience when you forget to give yourself an infinite boost. There are other smaller updates, but I've gone over the more major additions to the game. It's kind of funny how most of the better additions to the game are through smaller features like the jump deceleration, disabling the power boost cutscene, and the jukebox. Don't get me wrong, I think the other additions to the main game are fine enough, and the fact that they're free makes it all relatively harmless by default, but at their worst, they're forgettable or just something I didn't bother with. Like the Battle Rush mode, which I almost completely forgot to mention because I had absolutely no interest in playing it. And being 100% honest here, I had my eyes set on the New Horizons story DLC, because not only would that fix up the story a bit, but would also give us 3 new playable characters and fix up the final boss. And geez, where do I begin? Well, story-wise, this doesn't really hold much significance for 2 reasons. For one, this all takes place on the 5th island only, so this scene, where it would make complete sense to let us play as Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, is still just as dumb and pointless as before. Even more so when the new story begins with the 3 coming back to their cyber forms. And 2, the entire New Horizons DLC is more like an alternative take on the 5th island, as it's completely removed from the base game story on the 5th island, and ends a bit differently too. Honestly, a bit of an underwhelming choice, but I kind of expected it, since adding a new story to the main game would change far too much. But getting into the story proper, Sonic decides to take a bit of the cyber corruption to get the trio back to their cyber forms and help look for the emeralds, while Sonic climbs up more towers to face the Koco trials and convert his cyber corruption into a new power. But immediately, I have a problem with that. In the main game, no one could help Sonic because they weren't able to interact with anything in the real world. But here, they're interacting with everything just fine, attacking enemies, breaking walls, and even gathering the emeralds. So they couldn't help before, but they can now? As far as I know, they don't really explain this in-game, but you know, whatever. So while the trio gathered up the emeralds, Sonic faces the trials that are given by the Koco on the towers, who are actually the pilots of the Titans. So he completes the trials to nullify his cyber corruption and talks to the last Koco to convert that corruption into a new power, leading to a trial that clearly wasn't playtested, but more on that later. After gaining the new power, everyone comes together, Sonic goes Super, and fights Supreme, which is the same as before. But once Supreme is defeated, the End takes control of it, pushing Sonic to use his new power and destroy both Supreme and the End at the same time. After that, it's basically the same ending as the base game, but Sage lives, which still doesn't matter because she was revitalized at the end of the base game too. Again, the story really doesn't hold much significance. The events are different, sure, but that doesn't mean much when the ending is basically the same as before. It's probably different just to serve as an explanation for why we can play as Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, which I'm completely fine with. But that's where my next problem comes in. The new playable characters. Look, I don't hate that these three are playable again in 3D. I'm really glad that they're here. However, they're not as fleshed out or developed as I hoped they'd be. Let's start with their movesets and skills. Starting off, they have absolutely nothing to work with. All they got is a boost, jump, double jump, and a third jump that's unique to each character. They can't attack, parry, stomp, or even side loop. You need to unlock those moves first. And that's all fine, right? It helps to let players slowly adapt to each character's moveset. That's true, but as a result, this severely limits their combat abilities since most of their unlockable skills are taken up by moves that Sonic would have by default, and their other skills are focused more on movement and platforming. Each character also sports their own stats and levels, so each character has all their stats at level 1, making them even weaker than Sonic by default. And the enemies that you can fight are so powerful and so fast that combat for the trio is not even an option. So instead of fighting enemies for skill points, they're instead given to you by fighting the specific Koco. However, this leads into the next issue, albeit a smaller one. Most collectibles you find are character specific, so Koco who give skill points or reveal more of the map are mostly assigned to a specific character only. And I was terrified of going through something like DK64, where you need to switch back and forth between characters to collect things. But thankfully, that isn't a big problem here. It's only an issue if you want to open up more of the map, since there are also character-specific challenges for those map Koco. But here's the thing, you can't change characters freely until you're basically at the end of the story. So if you want to collect everything and reveal the entire map, you might as well do everything with one character as soon as possible. But even if you are at the end, the only way to change characters is to talk to this Koco on the final tower, which is a huge inconvenience for 100% completion. And what's worse, since the map can be revealed by 4 separate characters, activating a map Koco barely adds any more to your map, which is a far cry from how much was uncovered before. Sometimes the map Koco doesn't even reveal any collectibles, so at that point you might as well run around and find what you're looking for instead of slowly uncovering the map bit by bit. Okay, let me slow down here. I know I'm being pretty negative, so let me talk about what I do enjoy with the trio. First of all, having each character with unique moves is nice to see. Each character clearly has their strengths and weaknesses, like how Knuckles doesn't have much moves for vertical movement, while Tails and Amy can ascend vertically all on their own. But as a trade-off, Knuckles and Sonic can climb up certain walls, while the other two can't. They do share some moves though. They can all boost, have a gliding move of some sort, and can learn an ability that activates only with max rings, similar to Sonic's power boost. And with how powerful some of these moves can be, it's honestly pretty easy to cheese some challenges and head straight to the collectible from a high point. Since Skill Koco or Map Koco need to be on a platform, it's fairly easy to finish one obstacle that's high up in the sky, and then glide to the next one to skip the challenge altogether. And while I enjoy how overpowered these abilities are, they make things far easier than they should be, especially when each character has one utterly broken move. Knuckles can use an infinite glide, or use an exploit with his 3-punch combo to infinitely fly upwards. Amy has an absurdly high bounce move that can be used with her double and triple jump, allowing for very high and very far movement. And Tails just straight up flies around his mech, and I don't think I need to explain how broken that is. Sure, it uses your boost meter, but you can also have infinite boost, so have fun flying around the island, I guess. It's honestly insane how powerful each character can be, and in some cases, the game doesn't really feel designed with this in mind. For example, a story objective might require you to take this lengthy obstacle course, or you could just fly around or over the entire course and skip right to the end with no repercussions. Hell, even one of Tails' story objectives is just located high up in the sky, but because of the terribly short render distance, I can't tell how I'm meant to get up there, so I just use a Cyclone to fly up there instead of doing it the intended way. And those courses, man, look, I'll give them this. Some of these small challenges are kinda well designed around each character's abilities. Emphasis on some. There's a few points that really aren't designed all too well, and it feels more like a ROM hack than an actual official game. More notably in the towers you climb as Sonic. Some sections, like these walls you homing attack, don't respawn at all, so if you fall and have to redo this section, you'll have to walk in these thin platforms instead. And the towers themselves aren't exactly great either. They're challenging, sure, but it's very easy to fall and lose progress, mostly because there aren't any 2D sections like the ones on the 4th island. In fact, this entire DLC update has no 2D sections, so good on them for making that happen. But the problem with falling is that they don't drop zip lines as makeshift checkpoints, like they usually did on the 4th island towers. So if you fall, you better hope you're landing on something, otherwise you're losing a good chunk of progress. If you don't use parry jumps or dodge rolls to save yourself, you might as well change the game to easy so you can just get back to where you left off. And Jesus Christ, the visuals. Generally speaking, the visuals are still about the same. That means what's good is still good, but what's bad is still bad. So most of the game's structure is based on new obstacle courses, and since there's 4 characters, there's more of them in the island, with the same copy-pasted platforms and objects. As a result, Pop-In is egregiously obnoxious now. It's the same as before, yes, but they somehow didn't fix it even a little bit over 3 major updates, and it's really distracting when you see these big scale obstacles just appear out of nowhere. And when a bunch of these big blocks of pillars are just floating in midair, it starts to feel a bit off. Like before, I didn't mind the flowing structures, but now, with how much there is around the island, I start to see the problem. But the Pop-In just reinforces the issue even more. Again, I couldn't even find the intended path to Tails' story objective because I had no idea where the obstacle course even started. And it's a common issue too. Some objectives are just located in the sky or somewhere far out where it seems unreachable, until you look around and realize, oh, it was just this course made with cubes that's very close to the water jet plane. Like, I get how it can cause technical issues to increase the render distance for each console respectively, and it would need heavy playtesting and modifications to work well. But when it looks this bad, even on current gen consoles and PC, it's just an issue that can't be overlooked anymore. Like seriously, I thought the Pop-In was because of the Switch, so you couldn't just mitigate the issue a bit for consoles 2 generations more powerful? You couldn't even add a fade-in for the objects? And I don't know what happened to the cutscenes, but they seem worse than what was in the base game. Maybe it's less anti-aliasing or something, but they look a bit more pixelated. And the optional cutscenes are even worse, with the characters rarely even changing poses, and not even moving their mouths when talking. Not to mention, they add basically nothing to the game's story either. Alright, well, let's focus on Sonic for a bit. Since stats carry from the main game into the new story, he's basically the only character capable of combat. But the only enemies you can fight are powered-up mini-bosses, even more powerful than the ones in the base game's 5th island. So how are the battles? Well, they're not great. Every enemy has beefy health bars that take quite a while to beat, even with max stats, and every enemy is basically sped up, turning battles into wars of attrition. But I'll give them this, they removed more of the gimmicky elements from some of the enemies. The caterpillar no longer has a grinding minigame, but instead runs away from you and hurls a million projectiles at you. It's definitely an improvement, but with how shallow the combat mechanics are and how inflated their health bars are, it's not even worth fighting them for the one portal gear they drop. I avoided them whenever possible. It was just never worth the time. So many bosses aren't exactly the best, but what about the cyberspace levels? Maybe they've improved on them, or maybe they've made entirely new levels? Oh my god, these are so bad. I swear I lost a few brain cells from playing these, it's not even funny. Okay, so these cyberspace levels are basically remixes of other cyberspace levels, with new objectives and remixed layouts. Now let me talk about the level layouts first. They're not very good. See, hear me out on this, alright? I get what they're going for here. These levels usually have a bunch of splitting pathways and you have a lot of freedom to choose where you want to go. With the spin dash already unlocked, you can even get some crazy launches off ramps, and I think that's a neat idea. The problem is that the execution is not good at all. God, I don't even know where to begin. Okay, so the main problem is that they're reusing old cyberspace levels and trying to add onto what's already there. And I feel like this limits the design of the levels because they still have to follow closely with the original level's paths, so the different paths can't branch out as much on their own. And because of that, every path is usually too close to each other. And because of that, alongside the massive amount of copy-pasted platforms, these stages are a visual mess to play through. Heck, even with how spacious these areas are, alongside the camera's distance, depth perception can be a problem at times. And on top of that, Pop-In becomes an issue as well, since most of the stages reuse the same platforms instead of original terrain. And that becomes a major issue when you're looking for a hidden goal and none of the platforms around it show up, or are so hard to see because you're looking for a grind rail that can easily blend into the background. And when the level expands past the original level goal, there's nothing but these copy-pasted platforms everywhere, and it becomes so bad it gives off those ROM hack vibes again. And those new objectives, I honestly don't know how they could have gotten worse. So the original objectives for cyberspace were pretty simple. Get to the goal, collect some rings, get the red rings, and get an S rank. Yes, they were all really easy, but what made them okay is that they never disrupted the flow of the levels since you're meant to speed through them. Sure, you might need to stop and look for the red rings if you really couldn't find them, but you can still be quick about it and get an S rank and rings too. And if you couldn't do any of them, you still got at least one objective done as long as you beat the level, so playing it won't be a waste of time for you. The new objectives are as follows. Collect the moon rings, number rings, save the flickies, and either find a hidden goal, beat the hologram tails to the goal, or don't get hit by a hidden mine. So I usually wouldn't mind these objectives. Two of them are basically red rings but function a bit differently. Beating hologram tails is just the same as an S rank mission. The hidden mine one is basically a freebie, and the hidden goal one is usually not that bad. My problem is again the execution. The moon rings usually have you stop and collect them all because they'll disappear after some time, and because of how busy the stages are, it can be hard to track them down. They glow to help mitigate the issue, but with how zoomed out the camera can be, it can still be a bit hard to find them. Number rings hold a similar issue. Most stages just have you stop and collect them all because you have to collect them all in one run. You can't collect 2 or 3 and then the rest later, you have to get them all. And again, you have to stop in your tracks and jump around to collect them because they're all in a small section. Some levels do handle this a bit better, spreading them out so you can collect them as you progress, but if you miss a single one, you have to do the whole stage over again because there's no checkpoints in any of these levels. The mines, hologram tails, and hidden goal objectives I didn't mind too much. I think the hologram tails race really fits for these levels, but the rest are just fine. The one objective I have the biggest problem with is the flicky missions. These are just so backwards to me. So the objective requires you to rescue all the flickies in a stage, and that's not so bad on paper, but finding them is already kinda hard with how small they are and how out of the way they can be. But okay, you find one, and now you gotta carry them all the way to a certain point, but now your speed is cut in half and your only move is a small jump. Quick question, why does this exist? Why specifically in cyberspace 2? These levels are designed for you to blaze through them as fast as possible. What's this escort mission garbage doing here? It's kind of funny too. The music, which I'll get into later, is so energetic and really encourages quick gameplay, but you're just here carefully carrying flickies on your back. Like, man, I'm going really fast, aren't I? And is it really a surprise that you have to save all flickies in a stage to complete the mission? Not just one of them, all of them? And there's usually about 3, sometimes 4 in a single stage. Nope, not doing it. I never completed a single one of these. Just the thought of it makes me tired. And that's not even the end of it. How about some stage-specific gimmicks too? I already mentioned the hidden mines, which is really pointless since you'll be flying over most of them. Well, how about a rocket boost that puts on this visual effect which makes it really hard to see things in front of you? How about a speedometer mechanic that changes your boost to something completely different? What about a bomb that basically acts like a time limit? What about low gravity? This absolutely reeks of experimentation, and it sure as hell didn't need to be here. And look, I personally don't mind gimmicks like these, but when there are a bunch of them, only used once or twice, and they don't really add much to the core gameplay, then I really don't see the point. I think the ideas are cool, and they would probably complement the gameplay pretty well if they were fleshed out a bit, but they just feel so unneeded. And if they wanted to make the ideas stick, maybe don't introduce them in one level and then immediately drop it. And I would go into the level design as well, but I think you get my point here. I seriously have no idea how this even happened. I just can't wrap my head around it. And what really sucks is that I can see what they're going for here, and it's not all bad. Speedrunning these stages can be really fun, probably the best stages to speedrun. But when there's rarely an incentive for doing so, and other objectives require you to stop or explore, it just feels so backwards to me. Other than that, it just really needs more polish all around. Okay, what else is there? The Koco trials are, well, on par with what I've said with everything else. Good on paper, not so good in execution, and needs more polish. And honestly, I thought having combat challenges was a no-brainer for a game with combat, but with how basic the combat is, I realized that it can get repetitive real quick. Not to mention, these trials are far too inconsistent difficulty-wise. One challenge will be a fight with basic goons, and the next one will be a confusing fight that I had to use speedrun strats for, and then you'll fight against one enemy with an extremely generous time limit. But by far, the worst trial is the last one. My god, the problems just never end with this game. So the last trial is a boss rush of the first 3 titans in their entirety, with 3 restrictions. 1, your stats are back to level 1, but you can still use all your skills. 2, there will be no rings available throughout the entire boss rush. And 3, your parry is now the perfect parry, which basically means you can't hold it anymore and you need precise timing. So just like anything else in this DLC, there are several problems with this. Now, having no rings is a fine challenge. Most boss fights have no rings to begin with, but the main issue with it is that Wyvern is a dedicated auto-scroller with a lot of downtime, and if you fail to parry his attacks or get hit by the missiles too many times, there's so much wasted time by waiting around. And since rings don't refill in between fights, you probably won't have enough rings to beat the knight your first time through. The other issue is not only the perfect parry, but the attacks you need to parry as well. So changing the parry so it has more strict timing is fine. That's quite literally how every other game does it. But with how many times you needed and used the parry throughout the game, you're probably used to just holding it instead of timing it. But it's not only that that's the problem, it's the attacks you need to parry. Since the fights are designed with the original parry in mind, the attacks are not as readable as they should be. So when you try to perfect parry an attack, they hit a lot later or a lot earlier than you'd expect. Take a look at this. Wyvern has a lot of build up for his first attack, and the parry lands here. Okay, well what about his next attack on phase 2? Well, his first attack doesn't have any build up this time, so that's alright. But the second attack lands right here. What kind of hitbox is that? And not only that, but the timing and build up for these attacks can be so inconsistent, it's not even funny. Like, look at this and tell me if you can parry this. No, what even was that? It looked like he was gonna hit me, faked it, and then the actual attack had a ridiculous build-up. What kind of garbage is that? And this happens with a lot of attacks. Some are just hard to read, some have weird hitboxes, and some have a mix of both. So unless you know exactly when the attacks will land, you're taking a bunch of hits and wasting your rings. Here's a tip. Don't play this on hard mode your first time through. Play it on easy or normal, since those increase the parry timing a bit. Seriously, it's almost essential given how weird these attacks are. I certainly didn't try this on hard my first playthrough, because it just took too much time to beat. Since you're playing through the entirety of each boss, that also includes the climb up, and for Wyvern, that means even more time spent on this slow auto-scroller, and it just starts to drag out for way too long. And if you get hit during the climb up, you lose so many rings, it's practically a reset. I did beat this on hard, but only after like 20 attempts on my second playthrough, and when I memorized when the attacks would actually hit. My first time through, I had to beat this trial on easy, and had to use speedrun strats again just to have a chance at beating it. This is by far the biggest difficulty spike in the entire game. There's no competition. This is what I meant when I said the trial wasn't playtested. I don't know how they thought an 8-frame parry challenge would be doable with these kinds of battles. It just doesn't make any sense. And that's not even the end of it for this DLC. God, I wish it was though. So finally, after all the trials and collecting all the emeralds, we have the final boss. First, it's Supreme, and it's the same as before, nothing new. But after that, we fight the End controlling Supreme, and after a few unblockable attacks, which is kind of unfair, we can finally use the perfect parry, which can block any attack. So let me praise this fight a bit here. The spectacle is very on point. I love the no-nonsense attitude of Sonic here, and the feral hostility of Supreme. Crushing Supreme with the side loop is just insane as an attack, and I really can't complain about it. Generally speaking, all the animation in this fight is on point here. Aside from this, what even is happening here? But that's about where my positives end. It's just like the other bosses really. Spectacle's on point, but the fight can be very hard to play through. So there's these orbs you have to deflect to stun Supreme, but if you're too close to Supreme, the camera gets obscured by these trees and you won't be able to see anything unless you back up. And when it comes to actually dealing damage, it just wasn't clear at all. So you can deal damage, but the end just heals it back up. So how do you stop that? Well, the game gives you a tip that the cable attached to Supreme is healing him, so there should be a way to cut it. But finding out how took the longest time ever. Do you just fly to the cable? No, because you'll still attack the head. How about stunning first, then going for the cable? No, because that does the same thing. What about the side loop? No, that just does more damage. For some reason, you have to attack the head, then dodge to go for the cable instead. And that makes sense, right? Well, here's the thing. Dodging has never been required in boss battles or just battles in general. Only parries have been required and are clearly the better option. And I always forgot that dodging was even a thing. Turns out that dodging is basically required for this fight, but I just never thought of it until my second playthrough. My first playthrough was full of me just attacking and trying to get to the cable somehow. It just felt so up to chance because I never thought that a dodge would get me to the cable. Like, if I can get right up to it normally, why can't I just attack it then? And the game gives you one tip, which I already knew, so it wasn't very helpful. And about those tips, before you enter the final battle, you see some tips on how to beat the boss. Problem is, you get more info by collecting things with the other characters, uncovering the map, and leveling up their stats. Why not just unlock a tip every time I lose in the fight? I'd rather just learn through trial and error instead. And even if you know how to fight the boss properly, this fight has so much elements to it that it can be confusing at times. Like this cutscene, which can either kill you or not depending on how much rings you have left. Or this part in the second phase where it looks like a cutscene, but you're actually meant to attack Supreme to interrupt his attack. But how do you interrupt it? By hitting him and dodging again, which somehow moves you up to his arms, and then you parry the flailing arms to pull off a counter attack. I'm gonna be 100% real here, I only knew this because I watched someone do it. Beforehand, I had no clue what to do, I just hoped I was doing something right. Things are just not conveyed well enough, and the fact that tips are locked behind completion percent does not help it. Still though, I'd say that this does serve as a better final boss than the base game, but when you consider everything that led up to this moment, was it really all worth it? The inconsequential story, decent characters, messy cyberspace levels, subpar enemies, and overall lack of polish. Was it really worth it just for a slightly better ending? I'd say kind of, yeah, but only because the base game didn't have much to begin with. And before I forget, I should probably talk about the music, specifically for the third DLC. So what they've got here is mostly remixes. Cyberspace and mini-boss themes get remixes, and there's a handful of original tracks, mostly for the trio. So I think that the character themes are fine. They're pretty laid back just like how most of the island tracks were, but they suit each character just fine. I didn't think much of them. They aren't bad or anything, but I guess none of them really stuck out to me. Mini-boss remixes are really nothing to write home about, mostly because I didn't hear them much since, again, I avoided them like the plague. And the cyberspace remixes are a mixed bag. But not because they're inherently bad or anything. I think most of the tracks are pretty good actually, but it's an issue I had with some of the base game's music too. So you know that one track in 4.1 that's super unfitting because it sounds like it belongs in a 2010 YouTube intro? Yeah, that's my problem with most of the remix tracks. Like, the original tracks could kind of fit the stages, but now that they're remixed, it doesn't even feel related to the game anymore. It's kind of like someone made the music and just put it in the game, rather than someone making the music for the game. Well, let's just wrap things up here. By all means, I think the devs bit off more than they could chew here. There's a lot of missed potential with what's here, and I personally think that this was held back not only because they were possibly working on Sonic Superstars at the same time, but also the fact that the game's framework is pretty rough already. Along with the smaller dev team size, I've got a good feeling that they stretched themselves thin here. And I'm hoping that for a possible sequel, they iron things out and work more on polish, and possibly pass on porting to the eventual Switch 2, because you know that's going to limit the game big time. Just like how the horrible render distance of this game is probably because of the Switch version. DLC packs 1 and 2 are generally pretty good. Given that it's all free, there's no harm in trying them out for yourself. I'd say that if you enjoyed the game enough, you could give it a try. The Spin Dash might even give a new experience in a new Game Plus file. But the third DLC is something else entirely, not exactly in a good way. If you're looking for more decent content, or you're very curious about it, you could check out the New Horizons DLC. But man, it completely misses the mark for me, and they were so close to nailing all the DLC updates. It really sucks that they had to fail on the biggest DLC update, but at least there's potential here that can definitely be worked on in a sequel. I'd still want other playable characters, and I'd keep the boss fights just the same, but please convey things better. And generally speaking, there needs to be a lot more playtesting and polish across the board. With a first entry like this, it can be somewhat excused, but not for the next game, especially if it'll only be on current gen consoles. Well, I'm hoping that Superstars will pick up the slack, but for now I'm keeping my expectations low like always. Anyways, that'll be it for me. Apologies for the lack of uploads, I've just been real busy lately. I'll try and get things back in motion, but at this point expect an upload basically whenever. As always, do all the YouTube stuff if you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you all later.